Well, this morning on Media and Society, we discuss the alarming number of journalists that are reportedly dying in the line of work in the Israel-Hamas conflict. We're asking, are journalists documenting their own demise as they report on the war in Gaza? Well, hello and welcome to Media and Society. I'm your host, Naledi Muleo. Of course, this is the show where we take a look at the intersection between the media and society. And as usual, this show really isn't complete without your input. So over the next hour, feel free to give us a call on 011-714-0661 or 0662. Let's get into our discussion for this morning. According to data from the Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ, the grim toll on journalists and media workers during the Israel-Gaza war is alarming. As of December the 31st, 2023, a staggering 77 journalists and media practitioners had lost their lives, with a substantial majority 70 being Palestinian. This marks a devastating escalation, surpassing the total number of journalists killed in an entire year in any single country. The first 10 weeks of the conflict have proven to be particularly deadly for media professionals. Shockingly, the latest update as of January the 12th, 2024 from CPJ's preliminary investigations revealed an even higher toll, with at least 79 journalists and media workers having perished among the more than 24,000 casualties since the war's onset on the 7th of October 2023. Now, the stark numbers include over 23,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza and the West Bank and 1,200 deaths in Israel, underscoring the profound impact of this protracted and tragic conflict on the press. Well, this morning we are joined by Aziz Yunus, who is, of course, a reporter, who is a Palestinian Jordanian, a reporter living in South Africa. He joins us now via Teams. Aziz, a good morning to you. We really do appreciate the time that you're giving us today.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
We also are joined via Teams by Safa Al-Ahmad, who is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker who has, of course, done various projects for the likes of BBC and PBS. Safa, a good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
We're joined by the CEO of Mail and Guardian. Of course, that is Mr. Thembi Safakuda, who joins us via Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Fakuda. We really do appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, he's also Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. Also joining us is Juanita Hunter, who is Assistant Editor for Politics and Opinion at News 24. Juanita, a good morning to you. Welcome back to Media and Society. Really good to have you with us once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Juanita, I actually want to start with you because I think part of the reason why we're having this discussion today certainly was something that was sparked by some of the work and public utterances that you have had yourself. You published a piece, an opinion piece for News 24 just on the 10th of January, essentially saying there is no excuse. We need to be speaking out for journalists that are working in Gaza at the moment. Let's talk about why this was such a passionate project or initiative for you to take up to really raise that alarm.
I think, South Africa has a unique perspective and lens through which we see this conflict, particularly because just, 30 years ago, South Africa experienced apartheid. And exactly what is happening in Gaza has happened to South African journalists. And it took international solidarity from journalists all over the world to assist, because we know when a repressive regime wants to, attack freedom, the first thing they do is they curtail the voices of journalists. And so, just this week, we relate to rest Peter Magobane, a well-known anti-apartheid journalist who were forced to take a stance when it came to the brutal apartheid regime, spent 500 days in solitary confinement. We talk about Percy Koboza. And so I had a conversation this week with Zubaida Jaffer, a South African anti-apartheid journalist who was put in solitary confinement when she was 3 months pregnant in the 80s. And so she said to me, she says she is horrified that South African journalists are choosing not to show unambiguous solidarity with journalists being killed in Gaza every single day. And I think that it is a responsibility for journalists all over the world, but more particularly in South Africa, to unambiguously stand with their colleagues in Gaza. What happened to the son of the journalist from Al Jazeera, his son, just sort of blew the lid on how targeted these attacks are on journalists and their families. And so the Committee for the Protection of Journalists has been talking about this for the last 100 days, but it's not enough. And it is not acceptable for journalists anywhere in the world, but more particularly in South Africa, to say this is a two-sided conflict and it is too complicated for us to show solidarity with Palestinian journalists.
Yeah, I mean, and you're of course talking about the death of Hamza al-Dadu. That's the son of Al Jazeera journalist Wael al-Dadu. That certainly caught the international community. And sadly, by the time of the passing of his son, there had been other journalists that had lost their lives already. And Safa, perhaps I can bring you in here, right, and talk about the stories that you are hearing about the conditions that journalists are working in Gaza. And then, of course, I know that you're looking at some of those conditions in Yemen as well.
I mean, I couldn't agree more about the importance of solidarity on this. But if I can go back and just question, if we're talking about media and society and the importance of words and how media frame the conflict, like even your introduction of the war between Israel and Hamas, I would question that as well, because the war is not on Hamas, really. The war is on Palestinians and not just in Gaza. And so the importance of understanding context and how we frame the conflict is vital, and us being able to show that solidarity as well, and understanding of the depth and the origins of what's happening now. And so, sorry to call you out on that, but it's not a war on Hamas. Israel can call it whatever it is, but in reality, there is a genocide being enacted on the Palestinian people in Gaza, and also in the West Bank. What's happening now is absolutely horrifying. And so in Gaza, what they are doing is actually killing people to silence them, to not testify, to not be the ones who are recording the war crimes that are happening on the ground. They're not only threatening them, they're actually killing them. They're killing them with their families. They're disappearing them. They're arresting them. And so all of that is happening actively inside Gaza, but in the West Bank, it's also extremely terrifying, because it's not only the Israelis who are coming into the West Bank to arrest and kill people, but it's also the Palestinian Authority that is acting on behalf of the Israelis in this so-called security apparatus that they have, and they're also silencing people. And that didn't start from October 7th. That started way before that. That was the raison d'etre of the Palestinian Authority for the Israelis, is to keep Palestinians in line in the West Bank, right? And so the oppression is multi-level in this way. I know it's easier to talk about in Gaza because, I mean, it's just terrifying. They are documenting their own demise. They are documenting their own death, right? And the death of their families, and they have to go on air and announce their relatives' death. I cannot even imagine how horrifying that is. But at the same time, I think, because the Israelis have succeeded, and now actually the foreign press took Israeli government to court, and the Supreme Court had actually ratified that the Israeli government has the right to stop foreign journalists from going into Gaza. And so it's not only that there's an active war, that they're trying to silence Palestinian journalists inside Gaza from covering it, but they're also stopping foreign journalists from coming in and also covering it. And this is an edict from the highest court in Israel, right? Yeah. And so everybody within the Israeli institutions have been complicit in the silencing of people inside Gaza, inside the West Bank, and also foreign journalists who are trying to come in. I cannot imagine, after 100 days of covering this inside and out in Gaza, that they are continuously waking up every day, if they're sleeping anyways, to do this, and then having no reprieve from that as well, by not being able to, like, you know, generally when you cover a war, you have 3 weeks in a normal circumstance, like, for example, in Iraq, you have 3 weeks, you rotate, somebody else comes in, you're able to sleep and take a shower. None of these things are happening inside Gaza. They're also having to worry about food, the security, the health of their families. I mean, the conditions are absolutely atrocious.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would love to talk about Yemen, but I mean, there's no comparison in the amount of oppression and devastation that's happening on the Palestinian journalists. And there was a journalist just killed yesterday. We're talking on a rolling basis here.
Yeah, we can bank Yemen till later in the discussion, because that, of course, speaks to the expanding of the conflict that we're seeing in the region. And I think it's particularly interesting for me that you called me out on the describing of the conflict as Israel-Hamas, because this really starts to speak to, where objectivity in the newsroom then begins and ends when we start describing the conflict that we're seeing. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, but I want to bring in Aziz, because Aziz, you really have a personal story where this conversation is concerned. You are a reporter living in South Africa yourself. You've lost 16 family members in the conflict in Gaza. So condolences, and thank you so much for being able to have the strength to speak to us. Talk to us a little bit about what you've experienced.
Thank you so much. To be honest, it's sometimes at the beginning, I was telling a friend of mine here in Cape Town, I told him, us from outside, the journalist, it's very difficult to even sometimes follow up. And we get some time to, switch off our social media, switch off the TV and take a break. And then my family story happened, and it became very difficult because you wake up watching the news, you go sleep watching the news, and it affects your daily life, whether you're married, you're single, you're working, you're not working. It's like something snaps and you become unusual, part of your life. So I told him about that, and he suggested that I speak about it. So I spoke to a couple of colleagues, but it's very difficult to understand the atrocity that is happening. And I know that we are part of the majority of the Palestinians who either lost like one or two. I know a couple of doctors, actually medical doctors in Joburg, who lost 22, 30, 35. Even the numbers, it become horrifying just for me to mention these numbers. Names sometimes doesn't matter, even though it matters to us. So as difficult as it is, it does affect your mental health. It does affect your ability to do work. But eventually we look on the ground and you see colleagues like Wael al-Dahdouh and other amazing colleagues who just lost his wife, who just lost his son, and then hours after he goes live on air, and people wants to hold his hand, to try to comfort him, but he stands there. Even in Gaza, they call him the mountain. He comfort everyone around him just by him standing, holding his mic, conveying the real message from the ground. It's very difficult to mention these things without thinking about your colleagues who are on the ground, who's losing their life every second during the day.
Yeah. Mr. Fakuda, I want to bring you in here. Juanita, as we started the discussion, talked about the importance of journalists around the world, but particularly here in South Africa, let's look at what we can do, needing to be more vocal about what we're seeing happening to journalists in Gaza, and certainly speaking out against the war in Gaza, which we've seen South Africa do in its approach of the International Court of Justice. What is it that journalists can and should be doing, and are we burying our heads in the sand as South African storytellers?
Yes, I think we are. But first of all, let me just say that, I worked with Wael al-Dahdouh in Gaza, spent a substantial number of time a substantial time in that office in Gaza with Wael. So I know Hamza when he was a little baby. In fact, when he was born, I knew him, the journalist that was killed last week. So, for me to answer your question directly, is that seeing what happened to Wael and his family, and to have this silence and unwillingness and dragging of feet in terms of condemnation of what's happening in Israel by our own colleagues, by the way. And unfortunately, it's an institution such as Al Jazeera, which has suffered a lot in this conflict. But we have this reluctance from our own colleagues, not only in South Africa, but around the world, where, some of us have made it our mission to amplify these atrocities whenever they happen, wherever they happen, to whoever they impact. But unfortunately, this time around, we don't see that enthusiasm. In fact, when this ICJ sitting took place both on the 11th and the 12th of this month, some of the international media organizations decided on a blackout not to show the happenings in the proceeding. That tells you that there's a challenge. And unfortunately, we find ourselves at the moment with a very weakened solidarity amongst journalism. I think when the dust settles, which is the new word that everybody uses in Gaza, you are likely going to see us and them for correct reasons. So you're not going to see the type of solidarity that we've had in the past because many of our colleagues have decided to hide their heads under the sand. And it will be very difficult for the journalists, particularly those of the global south, now to be enthusiastic in terms of their own solidarity and support of journalists from the global north. I think that's out the window henceforth. You're not going to see that happening anymore. I mean, if you have this quiet and silence, notwithstanding that there's been so many atrocities and harm, death on our own colleagues in Gaza, it's going to be very difficult to expect that the Gazans and other journalists from the global south are now going to be, enthusiastic in terms of speaking in favor or on behalf of other journalists in the global south. So it's an indictment. And I think we have to go back and rewrite the history books, including the principles of journalism, because everything is questioned. We've got this moral equivalency in terms of reporting, which is questioned. Our colleagues from the global north have violated every one of those principles in terms of the moral, equivalency. The truth versus objectivity gone out the window. So we're talking about new journalism here, and we have to be honest. That is no longer going to be the same. You don't expect that the journalists from the global south henceforth are going to be calling solidarity and global solidarity with journalists around the world. It's not going to happen. And we've seen this hypocrisy, irritating, disappointing from some people that you thought will stand firm in terms of journalism rights. That said no it. Institutions that we went out, some of us, in support of when their journalists were in trouble, nothing have been said. What we have at the moment is activism mainly emanating from Qatar and Doha, where many of the journalists are impacted. But other than that, you see nothing else happening. And this is a very, very sad day in history and in the journalism profession.
You see, what stands out for me about what you've said, Mr. Fakute, is you've talked about, you've called it a moral equivalence that you've essentially put on the table. And I could argue and say, well, there's the moral sort of expectation and then there's international law, right? And I read this, having taken this from the website of Reporters Without Borders, but these are resolutions that were made globally. Resolution 2222, approved by the United Nations Security Council on the 27th of May 2015, which extends and strengthens Resolution 1738, which was passed in 2006, reminds all parties in an armed conflict of their obligations to respect those who work in the media and protect them against all forms of violence. So this should be something that we understand globally, no matter what side of the discussion you're on. We're going to take some calls, though. 011-714-0661. Jacob is on the line in Johannesburg. Jacob, good morning, and thank you for calling.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I just want to appreciate what the journalists are doing, giving us enough and the best stories every day. But in the meantime, feeling sorry and touched as they put their lives in danger by entering or invading dangerous war zones. For example, what is happening in Gaza. They are reporting corruption within our government, investigating day and night. And many get threatened by politicians. And many get killed. So there's more that is being reported, but less being done in terms of protecting them, in terms of giving them or justice being done on what they are reporting.
Yeah.
So yes, I really feel sorry and appreciate what they are doing.
Yeah.
Yes, heroes die on line of duty. They
That's
are our heroes.
That's sad. Jacob,
They
thank
are
you so
our
much.
heroes.
Yeah,
Yes.
we really appreciate those words. Thank you so much for saying that. Jacob calling in from Gauteng. We're taking more calls on 011-714-0661. Stay with us, because when we come back, we're going to start talking about how we move the needle. What is it that needs to be happening here in South Africa and certainly across the globe to show solidarity with journalists who are putting their life on the line in conflict, particularly in Gaza. Stay with Media and Society. Welcome back. You're still watching Media and Society, and we continue with our discussion this morning where, of course, we're looking at the conditions that journalists are working in as they cover the war in Gaza. We're asking the question, are journalists documenting even their own demise as they report on the war? This morning on Media and Society, we're joined by a journalist who is on the front line in Gaza as we speak, Mr. Nizar Sadawi, who is a reporter with TRT World. He joins us live from Gaza. Nizar, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're speaking to us from your car, and I believe at the moment that is where you're living. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing on a daily basis. What's surrounding you at the moment? Perhaps we start there, Nizar.
Well, actually, as journalists, we had to relocate our offices, to relocate from one place to another inside Gaza. I mean, we're just as much as, we're just suffering, just like anyone else here in Gaza. We're all internally displaced. Personally speaking, I lost my apartment, my family's home, my own car. This is a rental, by the way. And we had to build tents. Makeshift tents, just like anyone else. It could be twice as hard for us because time for a journalist in the middle of war is a luxury. We don't have time. For example, because of the situation here, because of the fact that there is no food, no water, no nothing, people line up waiting to get, for example, some water, and they can stand in line for 4 or 5 hours, sometimes even more, longer. For us as journalists, we don't have that kind of luxury because, I have to be on camera. I have to either be filming or speaking to a camera. I'm a correspondent, so there's a bulletin most of the time. That's why I'm saying that sometimes it's twice as hard for us as journalists. Also, we rarely get a chance to make sure our loved ones are okay, for example, our families. Most of my colleagues, not just me, haven't seen their families in 100 days. That's how, today is day 100 in this war. Just a few minutes ago, I was actually trying to get some vox pops, taking people's opinion in the fact that this is day 100. And I was devastated because of the things, because of the things they told me. A woman said, for example, I lost half of my family. I lost my home. I live in a tent. And whether this is day 100 or this is day 1000, it doesn't appear that the world cares enough to do anything about this. Another person said, I don't care if it's 100 because I stopped counting, for example. He said, I stopped counting after the first 5 or so of my family too. That's the situation. Even counting the days sometimes becomes a luxury in a place like Gaza. The bombardment is continuing. The exchange of fire is also continuing. There are ongoing talks all the time, especially in Egypt. Pressure is mounting on both sides. What's happening in the ICJ might, bring a sigh of relief if the outcome is in favor of Palestinians. Palestinians have been watching, following the news. They salute South Africa for what it's doing, what it's still doing, actually. However, sometimes they get frustrated because they understand that even if there's a verdict in favor of Palestinians, it doesn't mean that the situation will immediately change on the ground. Theory is one thing, practice is another.
There's another, right.
That's the situation, that's the thing here. That's why people are becoming, that's why people here are actually very frustrated.
Yeah, let me ask you this, Nizar. And you talk about
the humanitarian conditions are actually making it worse.
Okay, I understand that connectivity is going to be an issue between the two of us, and perhaps we can also touch on that. And it's no surprise that you'd be displaced if 85% of the population of people from Gaza have lost their homes. So understandably, that would be the same for journalists that are covering the story, sadly, right? Talk about the protection, if at all, there is for journalists as you continue to do your work. And then the ease that you have in filing when we're hearing that there are periods of 24 hours of absolutely no connectivity in Gaza.
Yes, actually, this is day 3, and this is the 8th time Gaza has been cut from the outside world. Yesterday, there was an attempt by the telecommunication company team to fix some of the damages, but unfortunately that didn't work because of the bombardment. That's why we are still incapable of making or receiving phone calls or having any internet access. And if you're wondering how am I talking to you, it's because we as journalists have some backup lines from the Israeli companies. That's why I have some internet. It's poor, but it's better than nothing. But it also poses a problem, because when we contact our sources, as journalists, this is how we get information about what's happening. I may have internet connection, but my sources don't, for example. So what I used to get in 3 minutes now takes more than 1 hour, for example. That's the situation. As when it comes for journalists and protection, protection is a lost concept here in Gaza, not just for journalists, but for anyone. 117 journalists, that's an actual number. This is the number of journalists killed since October 7th in Gaza. Now, of course, I cannot say that anyone would be protected here, whether a journalist or not. Maybe I wouldn't be targeted directly, for example. But if I happen to be in a place where there is bombing and I die, I would be regarded as collateral damage. That's the situation. Yes, I'm a correspondent for TRT. Maybe, we are international journalists. I'm not local. So maybe Israel wouldn't target me directly, personally. It's not personal, but if it happens that I die in one of these attacks, I'm pretty confident that maybe I would just be regarded as collateral damage. The same thing for many of my colleagues, the majority of my colleagues, actually. It's rarely when Israel says or admits killing a journalist directly or intentionally. That's the situation. We wear our gear, our protective gear, but it's not really protective. What would a flak jacket and a helmet do with a missile from an F-16, for example? It makes sense. Yes, there are regulations we have. It does help when it comes to shrapnel. There was one incident not really long ago when an attack happened really close to our station, and I was on air. We actually caught it on air, and a piece of a shrapnel hit my helmet. It's still online, actually. So, no protection.
One last one before we go into an ad break, Nizar, and then we'll add our panel to the greater discussion. And that is, as you do this, and we talked about this, day 100, you're asking people in Gaza, and they've stopped counting. How are you coping with seeing all of this? One thing that came out, that stood out for me in the 84-page document that the South African government gave to the ICJ was the description of bodies, right, that in some areas are left to decay because there just aren't the resources to get them out or to give them a dignified burial. How are you processing all of this and still operating? What is it that I suppose keeps you going, and how difficult does it get for you to do that?
Well, it's heartbreaking. Burial rituals is important for Palestinians and for Muslims. And that has also become a luxury here during this ongoing war. There have been many mass graves all over the enclave, not just in 1 or 2 cities here in Gaza. And as I said, the war is ongoing. Both sides are still fighting. The bombardment is intensifying. Nothing is, I mean, there hasn't been any sign of de-escalation recently. Personally speaking, and this is a personal experience, my family left Gaza during the war. In the middle of the war, they had the chance to leave. And my mother passed away just a few hours after she left Gaza. And half of those friends who were offering their condolences to me, they were saying, well, at least she will be buried with dignity, because that cannot happen in Gaza anymore.
That's heartbreaking. Nizar, do stay with us. We're going to continue the conversation, and of course, also looking forward to getting your thoughts. We've still got our guests on the line, and we're going to talk about what needs to be done to show solidarity for journalists that continue to report on the war in Gaza, but seemingly are reporting on the deaths of their colleagues as well. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, we continue to have our discussion on how journalists are seemingly reporting on their own demise in Gaza. And of course, we continue with our guest, Aziz Yunus, who is a Palestinian-Jordanian reporter currently living in South Africa. We have Safa Al-Ahmad, who is a Saudi Arabian award-winning journalist and filmmaker. We're also joined by Tembi Safakute, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues and also CEO of the Mail and Guardian, also with Juanita Hunter, Assistant Editor for Politics and Opinion at News 24. Also a part of our discussion now, joining us live from Gaza, Nizar Sadawi, who is a reporter for TRT World, speaking to us from his car, which is where he's currently living as a result of having lost his car and home, and displaced himself as a journalist as he continues to cover this war. We've taken calls as well, 0117140661. I'll take just one last call. Tapelo's on the line. Tapelo, good morning to you.
Good morning, Usna Lady, and the viewers and everyone else.
Yes, what are your thoughts?
It was touching to see a father realizing his death of his son, who was doing a very critical work of assisting everyone to see what is really happening outside the world, far and near. And then, for what they are doing, it is a very great job, and it is dangerous. Then my question is, should we put them in such a condition? It's bad because somehow people or the upcoming ones will be afraid to put themselves in such dangerous areas. And I'm worried as of what is happening. And seeing all those people suffering, women, kids, and everyone else, it is very sad, including the journalists.
Yeah, losing their lives as well. Tapelo, thank you so much for calling in. Juanita, I want to let you wrap up because I know you need to leave us. And essentially, you really sparked this discussion for us here at Media and Society. And I'll let you have the last bite. In your opinion piece that you wrote for News 24, it was published, of course, on the 10th of January, so you can go and take a look at it. And you talked about Zubaydah Jaffa, how she was jailed for 42 days, 3 months pregnant as a journalist. But there's something there that you mentioned that is the difference that can be made when there is solidarity for journalists, right? And Zubaydah Jaffa is an example of that. There's, of course, the fear that, well, people can speak out about the state of journalists in Gaza, but what's it going to do? There can be impact, right, Juanita?
Absolutely. We saw that in South Africa's experience with the brutal apartheid regime, is that journalists were given lifelines when there was international solidarity, when people spoke up in the United States, when people went to the streets in the United Kingdom, etc., all over the world. And so, the solidarity is not a meaningless effort. It really, proves results. We do not have to come onto platforms like these to prove why journalists should not be targeted in wars. We should not have to constantly repeat how it is a violation of international law to target journalists covering atrocities. And so, and then, to get onto what Thembisa said earlier, that this conflict has changed the prism in which we operate. The fact that journalists do not have the luxury of removing themselves and coming back into the war zone, because they are the only ones who are our eyes and ears on the ground in Gaza. Secondly, we cannot shy away from the fact that journalists are being targeted. And who are they being targeted by? By the Israeli Defense Force. That's something that is not a disputed fact. It's something that the Committee for Protection of Journalists and many other international bodies, the United Nations themselves, has said so. And then thirdly, this attack on journalists made its way into arguments before the International Court of Justice, when South Africa's legal team put to the court that this is a continuation of what it argued was genocidal actions and intent by the Israeli Defense Force. And so it's not something that one can shy away from. Morally, we cannot accept the argument that journalists are simply collateral damage. Morally, we cannot accept the argument that over 100 journalists were just sort of a byproduct of this greater war on Hamas. I think that 100 journalists in 100 days, or even more than 100 journalists in 100 days, is a blight against humanity. Right. And if we as journalists do not stand up, we will be on the receiving end of such treatment. We'll have nowhere to go.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Juanita Hunter, of course, she is assistant editor of politics and opinion with News 24, and she's going to leave us now. Thank you so much. Safa, I'm going to bring you in here. You can talk certainly to us about what we then do with the argument of objectivity, and you raised this with us a little bit earlier, right? That a lot of the time what happens in the newsroom is a communication will come from the top and say, what we're going to call it, the Israel-Hamas war. We're going to call it this, that, and the other. At what point does integrity and objectivity then, seemingly become at odds, right, with each other?
I mean, I would have to take it further than what Thembisa says, and I think we are witnessing the death of mainstream media today because of Gaza, because of the coverage of Palestine, because it has brought forward all the hypocrisies and the racism and the white gaze that we've all been dealing with in different ways. But Gaza and Palestine have really put it into focus, right? And I was shocked yesterday when they did not air the ICJ proceedings of the day of South Africa, and everybody did for Israel. I'm like, you're not even trying. You're not even trying to be balanced, to give it a right of reply. All the stuff that they were pulling my teeth on every time I did a documentary about what is the balance, the right of reply of things. And I really think they've dug their own graves in this, because people are no longer waiting for MSNBC or CNN or BBC to actually report on what's happening in Palestine. And I don't mean just Gaza, but even the West Bank as well, or the ICJ. And I think this is a good and frightening moment at the same time, where we are now in this moment of we're no longer under the illusion of neutrality or balance, right? That is gone, right? Everybody's getting their news about Gaza, and they're following people in Gaza on social media to get that, right? What I would like to say as well, sorry, just to come back to another point about solidarity of journalists. I am extremely critical of solidarity on its own. As a Saudi journalist, as somebody who was a friend of Jamal Khashoggi, and everybody knows that the Saudi government assassinated him and cut him into pieces in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, everybody was talking about it. Everybody was talking about the journalists, governments were doing conferences on it. And now, today, where are we? Nowhere. It's business as usual with Saudi. It is business as usual, especially with America and the West to Saudi. All the court cases that were presented on his behalf have been thrown out in America and in Turkey. They've all been sent back to Saudi. It's all business as usual. And so I would caution I'm not denigrating that solidarity is not important, but it needs to be followed up with accountability, right? And this is why we are where we are in Palestine, because there has been no accountability. The murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, right? There was no accountability for that. If we're talking about just in Palestine and the impunity that Israel has enjoyed for decades now, since 75 years now, right? That has led us to the day we are in right now.
Let me ask you this, Safa. I need to jump in only because we're out of time, but I really want to get that. And you made a strong point. Solidarity needs to be followed up by accountability. What do you see that looking like?
I mean, the ICJ is a great start, right? I think the courts everywhere, if the West wants to pretend that it respects international human law, right, and respects the international body of the UN, then they are going to have to respect that and actually adhere to that, right?
Okay.
And so let's follow them where they claim they are, right? I don't believe that this is going to bring it anywhere, but in reality, we need to do that. We need to call them out and not just pretend that solidarity and putting out posters is going to be enough. I've had enough of that. I am in a very cynical moment about media, also about actual governments respecting human rights. I don't give a shit.
I need to bring in other guests, and apologies for some of the profanity there. I'm going to bring in Aziz. Aziz, talk to us quickly about what you see that solidarity looking like. What accountability that Safa's talking about, what that should look like. What do you want to see as justice, not just for your colleagues working in Gaza, but certainly for the family members that you've lost?
I want to see justice, one of the most important thing as well. But also, I want to see that journalists, they have the ability of being able to report the truth. It's one of the reasons that we got into this career, without being targeted. I remember one of the prime minister, the Israeli prime minister's Likud parties, one of the members said, hunt them down. They are as terrorist as the fighters, talking about the journalists in Gaza. So one of the most important thing that I was talking to a colleague and said that journalists are. Sorry, I lost my point here. I think Nizar is waving here.
Let me bring him in because I think he needs to I think he needs to be released. Nizar, would you want to give us a closing thought, perhaps a call to action from where you are before we release you? Okay, we've lost him. He does need to move on. Of course, he's got work to do as well in preparing a bulletin in just a few moments. This is while operating from his car in the middle of a war zone where he's very much aware that 117 of his colleagues have been killed where he is in just 100 days. You wanted to finish your point, Aziz. I'll let you do that.
My point eventually that what we believed in of so-called freedom of speech doesn't apply when it comes to journalists on the ground now. As South Africa did in the ICJ, redefined the international law and the law that applies to the West and to Israel, we need to do that when it comes to journalists as well, who's been targeted in Gaza and other places in the Middle East, and make sure that the oppressor applies and follows these kind of rules. And in this case, talking about Israel.
Yeah. Tembisa, can we bring you in here? What sort of discussions do we need to be having as continental journalists? I know that you obviously are a part of these discussions and really looking at research about how we start to bring those voices together, not just in South Africa, but certainly on the continent. What's the first step we need to be taking so that we have solidarity and accountability, as Safa has said?
Well, I think, Naledi, you're doing a good job as a first step. Having this kind of platforms and this kind of discussions is that, a start towards the process of solidarity. So one will be such problems to proliferate within mainstream media. Number two is, unfortunately, I have to say it, the ownership of media has to change. At the moment, you have media that's owned by certain people who look in a certain way, and they then dictate how and who is supposed to be covered. And until that changes, you're going to have a continuation of the same problem. The reason why we're in this position at the moment, the only channel that seeks to or is trying hard to show the pictures is Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera is owned by a certain type of people. So one, we need to change the ownership of media and news media in particular, because what you have here, journalists who try hard to report stories and foster solidarity, who get cancelled by the owners of these institutions because they feel that they are reporting against their own people. So until we change that as well, and this is what I think is interesting times, by the way. I think there's going to be a revolution in terms of how we cover news, and you're going to see more and more people now establishing their own news, as long as, of course, continue to tell the story that's supposed to be told. So the ownership of media and journalism itself has to change and reflect this diverse global culture and demographics. And until that happens, we are unlikely to have true journalism. But importantly, also, we need to create a situation where journalists have got much more stronger spines in terms of coverage. You know, we are all afraid because we're going to be cancelled. You're going to be deprived of, commissioned into much more attractive stories around the world. So until we create this generation of journalists who I don't think we're going to be moving forward in a way forward.
Brave journalism. Brave journalism needed to continue to forge us forward. Unfortunately, that's all the time we had, and I really hope that this conversation is impactful and that all of you are able to continue it in the various platforms that you all do operate in. Thank you so much to Thembisa Fakude, CEO of Mail and Guardian. Thank you so much to Safa Al-Ahmad, who is a Saudi Arabian award-winning journalist and filmmaker. Thank you to Aziz Yunus, reporter from Palestine, joining us here, currently living in South Africa. Juanita Hunter of News 24, and of course Nizar Sadawi, reporter for TRT World, who was speaking to us from Gaza. And I close off with a quote this morning from Tom Stoppard. It says, "I believe that if our aim is to change the world, journalism is a more immediate, short-term weapon." So as we close the show, let's continue to support and protect the storytellers of our generation. I'm Naledi Mulone from the rest of the team. Have yourselves a wonderful Sunday.